Hello fellow gaijins, welcome back to the Japanese Basics for Beginners series. This is episode 3. 私の家で私の犬はいつもそばを作る。私の家で私の犬はいつもそばを作る。This is a sentence I presented to you in the last episode, so let's break it down. First of all, I want to look at the end of the sentence. The verb tsukuru means to make, and it has a particle o in front of it, which means that it is an action that has to do with the object soba. Soba o tsukuru means to make soba. Now let's look at the next particle, wa. Wa marks the word that comes before it as the subject, which means that inu is the subject of the sentence. Itsumo just means always, which is pretty straightforward, so up to this point we know that the dog always makes soba. A no particle connects two nouns and often implies that there is a connection between them. In this sentence there are two no particles. The first no connects watashi and uchi, which means that the house has to do with me. It's my house. The same applies for watashi no inu. So the subject isn't just any dog, it's my dog. The last particle remaining is the de. De marks a place at which an action takes place, so in this case the place that is marked is watashi no uchi, so it means at my house. So now that we have broken down all the particles and the words they are marking, it's much easier to understand the sentence. My dog always makes soba at my house. Now I know the sentence doesn't really make sense, but I kind of like this fact because one cannot just understand the sentence by looking at one or two words, but one really has to look closely at the particles, their functions to understand the sentence, which makes it good for learning purposes. Today's kana are the katakana that start with N. There are 6 of them, which is kind of unusual because usually there are always 5, but in this case there are 6 because of the single N. Now the pronunciations are na, ne, ni, no, and nu. This episode contains a little bit more vocabulary than usual because it will help me with explaining grammar better and also making better example sentences. The first word on the list is hito. Hito, hito, namae, namae, atarashi, atarashi, anata, anata. Anata is rarely used in actual conversations because it is kind of rude to address people that you don't really know with anata. Usually Japanese people just use their name, but if they don't know their name, they would usually just ask for their name and then use it in sentences. In some instances, Japanese people too will use anata, but it's rarely used, and I would not overuse it because some people might get offended by it. Iku, iku, kuru, kuru, ashita, ashita, kara, kara, desu kara, desu kara. Iku means to go and kuru means to come. Now you know that to go and to come don't mean the same thing, but sometimes they are easily confused in Japanese. An easy to remember rule of thumb is that if you go somewhere, you just use iku, and if somebody comes to you, you use kuru. Before we talk about some new kanji, I want to tell you about a concept that exists within kanji. Now, you probably already know this, but kanji are very difficult. Now, why is that? It's not just because they are hard to read or write, but because the same kanji can have many different readings. The Chinese characters came to Japan when Japan didn't really have any real writing system, or they were still figuring out where they were, so their language was still evolving and stuff like that. So when the kanji came from China, they already had their own language, so they didn't want to give up their own language, so they just made a system so that there's both readings, the Chinese ones and the Japanese ones. Per kanji, you distinguish between onyomi, which is the Chinese reading, and kunyomi, which is the Japanese reading. In the kanji section of this beginner course, I will just focus on vocabulary that has kanji and just show you those kanji, and I will not really focus on kunyomi and onyomi, but only on one of both, depending on what the particular vocabulary is using. Today I want to show you 4 different kanji. Watashi, taberu, inu, and hito. The idea behind choosing these kanji is because they are very useful in conversations and when texting with somebody. Except inu, which is for example sentences, and it keeps things spicy and exciting. Today's new particle is a very important one, and it's actually 2 particles that have the same function. Ni and e in this context are the same. You can use those 2 particles interchangeably, but I think ni has the upper hand here, so I would focus on using ni and not e. In some very, very rare cases, only ni can be used, which kind of makes it better to use. But there are other uses for ni which can make it a little bit confusing if you use only ni. That's why there are 2 different particles for the same thing, I guess. Ni and e indicate a final destination of a movement. We had iku and kuru. If you want to say I go to the house, you can just say uchi ni iku. Another example sentence is Anata wa watashi no uchi ni kuru. It means you come to my house. The next grammar I want to talk about is how to make questions. Let's look at polite sentences first. If you have a sentence that ends in a verb and you want to make this sentence into a question, you just add ka at the end. For example, soba o tabemasu ka? Now instead of you eat soba, it means do you eat soba? Keep in mind this is the polite form because of mas and because of ka, which is usually only used with this polite form. If you don't have a verb at the end of the sentence, you will probably have a des because you want to make the sentence polite. When you have a des at the end of the sentence, you can again just add the ka and it becomes a question. Anata no uchi desu ka? Anata no uchi desu ka? This particular question just means, is this your house? Now you know how to pose questions. Jiko shokai. This is a concept known as self-introduction. When you make a self-introduction, what is usually the first thing you say? Your name. A sentence that you will see everywhere in any textbook or in any internet forum where beginners are writing their self-introductions is Watashi no namae wa blah 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 desu. Watashi no namae wa is not a good sentence. It is very rarely used by Japanese people. It's much easier to just say your name and then desu at the end. This is the easiest fashion to introduce yourself and also the most casual, which still has some sort of politeness to it because of the desu. I think this is usable in any sort of situation as long as it's not a business kind of situation. But if you're talking to somebody who is a potential friend or just somebody you know, you should totally use this. In my case, it would just be rimasu desu. Of course, Japanese people wouldn't pronounce my name as Rimas, but as Rimasu, which sounds kind of strange, but that's just the katakana way of writing it. So if I would introduce myself in Japan, I would just say Rimasu desu. In the last episode, we talked about verbs and the masu form. Now I want to add something to this real quick, which I forgot to mention, and that is that all the verbs I have taught you up till now are in dictionary form. For example, taberu, tsukuru, suru, iku are all in dictionary form. And what I forgot to tell you is that dictionary form doesn't mean that it has to be something that you do in general, but it can also be future tense. So iku doesn't just mean I go, but it also means I will go. It depends on the context of the sentence, and you will usually notice if it is future tense or not by looking at the words that have to do with time. For example, tomorrow or today or afterwards or now. So it makes a big difference depending on these words. This applies for the must form as well, because the must form is basically just a polite form of the dictionary form. Now that we know all those new verbs, we can really start to talk about the must form in more detail. Up till now, we've only looked at the iru and eru verbs and how they are used with mas, but now I want to tell you about all the other verbs and how they are usually used when you want to make something polite. If it is not an iru verb, let's take for example iku, the u at the end of the verb just becomes a I, and then you put mas at the end of it. Iku just becomes ikimasu. Tsukuru becomes tsukurimasu. Tsukurimasu. Suru and kuru are exceptions though. Suru becomes shimasu and kuru becomes kimasu. I guess you just gotta remember those, and it's only 2 of them at the moment. Actually, in Japanese, there are very few exceptions to the rules, so this makes the grammar a lot easier than one would think. Once you have understood a grammar concept, it's really hard to do something wrong because there are so few exceptions. You may have noticed that now we can actually make pretty good sentences. We can talk about the present, we can talk about general things, the future, we can even pose questions now. Japanese grammar can be so easy if you just concentrate on the right things at the right time and ignore all the difficult stuff like 2000 kanji and more and the other grammar structures that can be super confusing as a beginner, but actually quite easy if you are at the intermediate level. Let's look at the example sentence I have for you today. One thing I want to preface though is that I will not read the sentence out loud anymore until we talk about it in the next episode. I want you to read the katakana that we've learned on your own, and if you forgot, you have to practice them by just reading them again without hearing me say the words. Of course, at the beginning of the next episode, we will look at the sentence and break it down. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned a lot from today's episode. If you liked the episode, throw the shurikens all over the like button. Consider subscribing so that you're notified for when I upload new episodes for the series. And check out the flashcard sets I made on a website that is called Quizlet. They will help you a lot with studies and it is free, so why not use it if you can. I'll see you in the next episode. Mata ne!